Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. Several familiar faces. For those that can't perhaps see me or see the screen, I'm a white man wearing a dark top, short hair, glasses, and I'm sat in a plain office. And on the screen is a slide, and I'll always try to describe the images when they come up. And what have we got here? We've got the title of today's talk, which is Collecting Kelvin. And we've got a picture with an intriguing caption, Glass Lampshade Broken by Lord Kelvin. So moving on to my next slide, which I'm not moving on to. Oh, here we go. On the screen here, we see a large outdoor statue of a seated man, a seated and bearded man. And this is the homepage of the University of Glasgow's Lord Kelvin 200 web pages. And the theme for today is kind of memorialization. How does someone get memorialized? What work goes into that process? Who does that work? And I'm going to do that just through a couple of examples of telling some stories about some objects in the Hunterian's history science collection relating to William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, who was born 200 years ago this month. So, new slide, idea number one, memorialization begins early. Okay, and I'm moving on to another slide, which has a picture of a contemporary image of a large glass case at the Hunterian in 2024 with two items inside it. One of them is the University of Glasgow's model Stirling air engine, and another is the extremely famous, or even more famous, model Newcomen steam engine, famously found faulty and fixed by James Watt in the 1760s. And these both are objects on display. And what do I mean by memorialization begins early? Well, on the screen we see these objects. Here in my next slide is a catalogue from 1877, from an 1876 exhibition. And I'll read some of this out to you. This is actually, if I go one more slide, so I've got that wonderful 2 pages from this catalogue, and then the same catalogue, and then there's a map, a diagram of the South Kensington Museum in 1876. And this is an exhibition 150 years ago, a catalogue of the special loan collection of scientific apparatus at the South Kensington Museum. Section 12, applied mechanics. Section 12.3, prime movers, stationary engines. And at the very top of the page, I can read Newcomen engine repaired by Watt, the property of Glasgow University, loaned by Sir William Thomson. And then almost at the bottom, we see item number 1940, working model of Stirling's air engine. What does it say? Presented by the inventor, the Reverend Robert Stirling of Galston, to the natural philosophy class of Glasgow University, and used constantly for lectures, and again loaned by Sir William Thomson. So both of these objects in the 1870s are very much considered to be of historic importance. But William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, in loaning these objects, he's not just memorializing Stirling, who made the air engine, or Newcomen, who designed the steam engine. He's also memorializing very much himself. Let's look at what he said 30 years previously. So I'm going on to another slide with some quotes, which I'll read to you. And this is William Thomson in, I think, 1847-ish, aged 22. 1850. I have found a Stirling's air engine in our Augean stables and got it taken to pieces, as it was clogged with dust and oil, and I expect to have it going as soon as I have time. So he's talking about finding, I'm just going back a few slides, the Stirling air engine, which you see on display in the Hunterian on the left-hand side. In the 1840s, age 22, this is an object that's only 20 years old, and he's comparing himself directly to the Greek mythological figure Hercules. So clearing out the Augean stables is when Hercules did the heroic task of clearing out these cattle stables by knocking a hole through the wall and diverting a river through it. So this is memorialization. Let's be very clear here. This is quite an aggrandizing thing to do, to describe to yourself as a 22-year-old, and this is recognized by historians. I've got a quote here on the screen from Crosby Smith, from a very good book called The Science of Energy, A Cultural History of Physics. And he makes it explicit that by cleaning out the stables, Thomson, Lord Kelvin, is is clearing and cleansing Glasgow natural philosophy, unreformed for 3 decades, by the new professor who's eager to turn it into a modern Victorian science. So this is a kind of an answer to the question. Memorialization starts early. If we're celebrating someone 200 years after their birth, in part it's because of their own contributions, not just to their work, but also to their recognition and their memorialization of their work. Okay, so another way of thinking about things is memorialization is about the future. And I'm not trying to be particularly clever here. Like, memorialization is about the past, it's about the present, it's about the future, it's about all these things. These are quite historically or historiographically orthodox things to say, but let's think about how you make a legacy for yourself. So I'm going forward to another slide with 2 images. On the left, we have a dark wooden set of steps with an oily dark substance pouring down the steps seemingly. And on the right hand side, we have a close-up of a almost identical device where you can see this shiny oily substance. And these are 2 very famous and quite odd and really interesting objects in the Hunterian's collection. One is on display in our museum, one is in storage here at our collection study center. This is the artificial pitch glacier experiment. And if you can read the text at the bottom, it says the first one is begun in 1887, and the second one is a replica begun in 1915. So these are almost experiments which keep going. They have longevity, they persist. What exactly are they for, or what do they do, is a slightly open question. Kelvin is, on the one hand, pointing out that a substance such as cobbler's pitch, which will shatter if you hit it with a hammer, will also flow like water, like a glacier, under certain conditions, under the continuous application of a very small force, namely gravity. It's also deeply kind of metaphorical or analogical. He made some connections which we would consider to be wrong, but at the time made sense to him, about the ether, which was the all-pervasive substance that he and others thought must be present throughout the universe in order for electromagnetic waves to be dispersed through the universe, but also to allow very large bodies like planets and suns to move through it. So this mysterious substance that was both tangible and intangible. But it's also this quite poetic gesture to the vastness of time, and this is why it's inspired artists as well as others to look at it, because it just goes on and it moves very, very slowly downhill, like a glacier. Everything is in motion, which is quite a nice sort of poetic thing. So I'd suggest one of the functions of this experiment, if you want to call it an experiment, is to push its maker, Kelvin, into the future. Because the one thing you do if you make an experiment in 1887, which will almost last forever or for hundreds of years, is you're kind of ensuring your future. And it wasn't necessarily the case that he anticipated it being in a museum. He would have anticipated it perhaps being in his laboratory or on the shelf. But certainly to be seen, it's certainly a visual object. So there's lots of ways in which we can encounter these quite odd objects, and thinking about them as types of self-memorialization, I think, is quite a nice way of doing it. And very briefly, to take a slightly more explicit or maybe more comprehensible example about what we might think of as long durational experiments, is something which persists still today in the Glasgow Senate Room. This is in the central building at the University of Glasgow, in a room which was William Thomson, Lord Kelvin's research and teaching laboratory in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. And on the screen, I've got 2 images. I've got a close-up of this blue and red glass tube against a wall in a cupboard, and then a sign next to it. And I'll read you the sign. An investigation by Sir William Thomson, later Lord Kelvin, Professor of Natural Philosophy, commenced during October 1872. So the right-hand tube contains a column of water surmounting a column of copper sulfate solution. The left-hand tube contains a column of colored alcohol surmounting a column of water. So William's observations on the subsequent migration, we would call that diffusion, of the liquids each into the other, are written on the backing paper. So what's happening with this? Again, it's an experiment we're not really expecting it to be falsified or for it to prove anything other than what we expect. If diffusion stops happening here, we're unlikely to revise our views on Brownian motion. That's not really the point of this experiment. It's visual, it's theatrical, even though it's very, very slow moving. And it also persists. So if we look onto my next slide, which is a letter to the editor from the magazine Physics World, February 1989, we see a request from the Guinness Book of Records asking for some information about the world's most long-lasting experiments. And it claims this experiment, it's referring to the diffusion experiment we've just seen, is due to be concluded in another 100 years or so. So that puts it at something like 2080, I guess. And I'm not actually quite sure if that's true. I suspect that most of the diffusion has already happened. I don't think we're going to dismantle the apparatus in 70 years, 50 years time. It's not quite what we're going to do, but there's hubris in setting up an experiment which will last for hundreds of years, and that's quite cool. It's quite interesting. I'm not necessarily saying it's wrong, but it's a form of making sure everyone remembers you. So there's two kind of ways of thinking about memorialization. I have another couple. What have I got? Oh yeah, museums make relics. So let me look at my notes where I've got quite lost on. Oh, here we go. So museums make relics. So one of the points here is museums don't just collect relics, they are actively involved in constructing them. We have here a wooden object with a slightly scruffy label. I'll read the label to you. Non-conducting handle for hot water tap, fitted on by Lord Kelvin with his own hands. So it's Kelvin's radiator handle. Moving on to another image. This is the image we saw at the beginning of the broken glass in the box and the yellow measuring tape. Glass lampshade broken by Lord Kelvin. So there's a couple of things to say here about the making of relics. So the heroes are sometimes made through the veneration of relics. That's something that museums and other institutions which collect and display do. Relics sometimes have causal powers through their supposed purity or authenticity and their direct connection back to an originary event or person, and perhaps a holy person. They bestow certain powers. And often with relics, the more implausible the causal chain and the more fragmentary the relic, the more mystique and power they have. And I think we see this going on here with this lampshade broken by Kelvin. It's not an interesting research object. It's also probably not broken by Kelvin, but mystique is added to it by the virtue of talking about it and writing these labels and then storing it. There's an issue about like storing up problems for future storage. That's a separate issue. This is, I think, about veneration and the creation of a very certain type of history. And I think it's a problematic one. So with respect to the tap, if I go back 2 slides, we'll see this description, fitted by Lord Kelvin with his own hands. There's something quite weird about that. And there's almost a moral story to these things. And to be serious, I care about these relics because they all contribute to reducing the history of science at the University of Glasgow in the 19th century to stories about a lone man and a lone genius, but also they emphasize his isolation and almost provide a kind of contextlessness to it all. Like why are we collecting lampshades broken by one person and not another if we're really interested in like the full variety of people working with techniques and technologies and materials in this big city at this big university? So these things are not harmless. The relic making is not harmless, and it's not just funny, I think. Lastly, so that's 14 minutes. I'm going to do another 2, maybe 3, if that's okay. I might go for 4. The memorialization possibilities of broken objects. So having presented to you some broken things, which I think are a bit weird and possibly a bit problematic, let's look at a couple of brief examples and then end with another example of a Thomson Kelvin related object. So obviously museums are full of fragments and they're full of incomplete things, broken things, shards. Archaeological collections, for instance, are full of fragments. Let's take some comparisons. I've got 4 images here on the slide. In the top left-hand corner, we have a very characteristic display of a steam engine. You remember we looked at steam engines right at the beginning of the slideshow. This is in the Deutsches Museum in Munich, and it's dissected. It's almost like a diagram. There's implied that it works. There's a nice fit between theory and practice, made apparently real by this 3-dimensional thing on display. And then in my other 3 images, I've got the frequent reality of steam engines, which is explosions. Things don't work. They blow up. There's not a precise fit between theory and practice. Also, things wear out. Things get recycled. Things get used up. So the 2 strikingly different types of images tell very different stories about science, technology, and engineering. And in the bottom left hand, we've got an image of an exploded boiler in Paris in the 1850s. A further comparison on this next slide, we see again the dissected boiler and the exploded boiler. And then I've got an image from, I think, 17th century military warfare or naval warfare. The line of battle as imagined by theorists, and then a more realistic view of the same action. So on the one hand, we have this geometry of warfare. The boats, the sailboats are lined up perfectly, just as they would in the textbook of warfare. And then the reality in the bottom image is literally the fog of war. It's cloudy, it's messy, it's smoky, it's dirty, it's non-pristine. Lots of comparisons between the presentation of military practice and scientific practice. Very last comparison, I bet you didn't think you were going to see 1980s images of sausage making machines in museums, but here we are. What's my comparison here? Very briefly, this is from Sharon McDonald's very famous anthropological study of a big exhibition in the 1980s about food science and about the role of industrial production of food in modern society. And very tellingly, the National Dairy Council sponsored milk making machine didn't work. It produced horrible discolored milk. Likewise, if you see the caption of the image of the 2 people in the museum in white lab coats holding sausages, and the caption reads, "The naughty sausage machine performing at last with human assistance." So one of the conclusions here is don't put sausage making technologies on display in museums. But the other is if you're very invested in saying that sausage making is fabulous and clean and pristine and modern, the museum itself might be a place that undermines that story. The fact that the machines failed to work when put on display is a great example of why we collect material culture. So lastly, to bring it back to Kelvin, sort of, on the left, we have a broken object. And I think this is a good broken object. Sometimes broken objects are good, sometimes they're bad. Sometimes objects, regrettably, are broken through poor curatorial or custodial handling. Sometimes there's a very interesting breakage in an object because of the way it was used in its earlier life. So we have good breakages, bad breakages, good dust, bad dust. And I really like thinking about what stories are undermined or made more complicated by showing scientific instruments not in their pristine state, for instance, when they were first made, because so many scientific instruments in museums have never been used. That's why they're so beautiful. And also it tells us the life history of the object, but also it tells us that things don't always work. So this very important type of precise electrical measuring device, which Kelvin was intimately involved in developing and making a lot of money out of, sometimes they don't work, or they expire, or they blow up. And lastly, I've got a very similar shiny item on display. On the right-hand side, it's not a particularly well-taken photo. And then on the left, the similar item, but broken. So the comparison and the contrast, I think, is really interesting. And it tells us a more complicated memorial story. And that's my 4th way of thinking about memorialization. And that's 19 minutes. And I'm going to stop.
Thank you very much, Nicky. So from broken lampshades to dirty sausages, we covered it all. Thank you for that. That was fascinating. Again, yeah, if anybody's got any questions, you can pop them in the chat or feel free to unmute yourselves now and ask away. I have a question for you, Nicky. Just going back to the object that you showed in the beginning and the pitch experiment, with that sort of substance moving very slowly through it. I wondered if there are, and I'm sure there are, any conservation issues that might need to be considered when we've got objects that are constantly in motion.
Right. Hang on, am I muted? I can't see
You're
myself.
not muted.
I'm not muted. That's good.
Yeah.
I'm fiddling around with the grid view. Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I mean, one answer is that everything moves. Um, so so I'm really disconcerted by not being able to see myself. If I scroll up, I apologize, folks. Hang on. Yeah, I clearly need to see myself on Zoom in order to not be weirded out. That's interesting. I hadn't realized that before. Yeah, so I mean, one thing to say is that everything moves. Very famously, the art historian Michael Baxendale described medieval wooden lime wood sculptors in Germany as working not with sculptures but with very slow moving mobiles, because the wood over the course of the day in which you're carving it, according to the amount of moisture in the room, moves, and you have to accommodate it. And it's the same for people conserving things. Everything moves. At the same time, like artworks or that purposefully disintegrate or fall apart or develop mold were often developed by people in the 20th century almost to make a challenge to museums, to make artwork difficult to catalog or to conserve as a kind of anti-museum gesture. But with things like this, it moves very slowly. What we should probably do is set up a really good quality webcam and record the movement of the pitch over a 10-year period, because it will be tiny. But it would be quite fun to do. Much more importantly, to be honest, is the more mundane aspects of conservation, like keeping it secure, keeping the temperature fluctuations as low as possible. So actually, the worry would be moisture and woodworm, which is why, of course, we have such pristine and beautiful conditions in our amazing collection study centre. But yes, things that move are fascinating, and things that move really slowly are fascinating. And yeah, you can never fully resist change.
Brilliant. Thank you. We've got a question in the chat from Kevin, which says, is the broken lampshade the oddest example you found of a relic object connected to Kelvin?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think it probably is. I mean, odd's an interesting word. I mean, we could unpack that. Yeah, I mean, it certainly suits my argument best. We don't have anything particularly icky relating to Kelvin, would be another way of putting it. So we in the Hunterian collection we have. I'm sure some of you must have seen. There are jars of Lord Lister's urine on display in the main museum, and it's got this label written about 15 years ago that says, "Look at how good Lister was with his technology. This urine is clear," and you look at it and it's brown. It's like that. So that's a good example. And there are also some other jars of urine elsewhere in the collection, all carefully looked after appropriately, because these are biohazards. We also, I think Lizzie's in on this chat. Lizzie can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we've got somebody, we have a variety of like formal dresses and uniforms, like university gowns and so forth, but there's definitely somebody's underpants. But in terms of an object, cleaned hopefully, but in terms of an object that kind of is treated like a relic, and I mean that quite consciously in terms of the religious connotation, I think the broken lampshade does the job really well. So no, it probably is the oddest, but we are still moving objects from remote storage into our new storage facility. So we may, although it's not true that we discover things which were, on dusty shelves, neglected, because, we're caring for all things, but we will probably find some other things. Certainly, if I'd had more time, I would have shown you my slides of images which are all marked Kelvin miscellaneous, and there's quite a lot of plastic bags with scraps of things which could become relics if someone wanted to. As a curator, I'm quite resistant to the creation of new ones. Sometimes I think that we've just got scraps of wood and metal which came from a laboratory from 50 years ago. They perhaps don't have that much value, and we should think critically about what to do with them. So that's a fairly lengthy answer to that great question.
Brilliant. Another one from Kevin.
Hi, Kevin.
Do you ever throw things away because you can't see the point of keeping them, Nicky?
Never. Let me unpack that. I would never throw anything. We dispose of things. And we have a deaccessioning policy and a deaccessioning protocol which we stick to, which would go in which proposed items would go through many stages of assessment before anything would happen. And throwing away is definitely not the term we would use. And the question is, would you throw anything away because you didn't like it? Is that a fair characterization of what Kevin
Because
said?
we can't see the point in
Can't see
keeping
the
them.
point. Well, again, we have to be very careful to not make too many assumptions about today's interests being tomorrow's interests. So famously in the mid 20th century, lots of taxidermy was viewed as unfashionable, also frankly very moth-eaten, and was burnt and thrown away, not particularly at the Hunterian, but at museums across Europe. And in some respects, that was a mistake. Likewise, things which are viewed as trashy or vulgar become the next generation's stylish retro material. So we're definitely interested in the balance between accessibility and storage. So we have a backlog of 20th century scientific instruments, which were collected in a really, really indiscriminate way. So repetitious. So repetition and duplication is often a good reason to consider disposal. We have things which are orphaned. So there might have been an interesting story to tell about it, but it's long gone because it wasn't catalogued appropriately at the time. Or just, yeah, we have 10 mid 20th century scruffy voltmeters and perhaps we only need one. With respect to Kelvin related material, that's not really the case. We have these fragments and these relics, but you can see that they have value because I'm basing an entire talk about them. I mean, they prompt great questions. But we have a large but well ordered and well catalogued collection of instruments that he made and that companies he was working with and related to, like Kelvin Hughes and James White made, where you can trace changes through different models, and also a set of quite spectacularly well-made late 19th century teaching models and objects, which have incredible persistence because they were so beautifully crafted, often by workshop makers and craftspeople in the University of Glasgow, and they all have great value. But in terms of the History Science collection and disposal, the things we are thoughtfully but carefully attending to are the mid 20th century stuff that was all collected in the 1990s in a really indiscriminate way, where we don't need massive duplicates, and also sometimes things are just hazardous, and we can encapsulate hazards or we can mitigate against them. But it all requires resources and money, and that's why we think in terms of collections development rather than acquisition necessarily. Like, how can we make the collection as a whole more accessible, more useful for teaching, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's a complicated question.